Welcome to our Tech Talk webinar to Cloud Affinity and Beyond, Building Network Agility Equal to AWS. My name is Sharon Fitzpatrick, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today's buzzwords revolve around having a secure on-prem cloud-based offering, especially within the federal government. But it is more than a location, it's a design principle, one where we reimagine networking for a hybrid world rich in cybersecurity, virtualization, robust analytics, container adoption, and more. It is no longer the future. It is here and driving change to open, agile, flexible, cloud-based architecture that offers high-level visibility and analytics. Our speakers today are Cameron Chehreh, CTO, Dell Technologies Federal, and Paul Unbehagen, Big Switch's CTO. They will share insights into how federal agencies found and implemented a hybrid cloud solution that is cost-effective, easy to implement, scales in scope, security, and analytics, as well as offers them a view of the future of hybrid cloud and what it needs to be successful at a federal level, as well as the challenges ahead. Before we get started with our questions, let's set the stage on where we think cloud-based solutions are today in the federal government. Cameron, what are your thoughts?
Good morning, and thank you, because I know it's quite early on the East Coast and West Coast for some of our participants, and a great big thank you to Big Switch, who's been a brilliant partner for Dell Technologies for many years. To the heart of your question, the cloud market today for federal government and public sector really is on a spectrum. And what I mean by a spectrum is there have been early adopters that have walked into the cloud computing space pretty quickly and have learned a lot of lessons. There are others that I would put in maybe the laggards of adopters column that are still trying to gain a sense of understanding how to build a robust cloud strategy. A lot of this has really been underpinned by some of the great work that Suzette Kent has done since taking the helm as a United States CIO and really updating this cloud first to a cloud smart strategy. And what we're seeing is emerging as a couple of things. First of all, cloud is not your grandfather's cloud as it was, because let's face it, cloud's been around now almost 20 years. Cloud really is an operating model. It is exactly how you started your opening salvo. It is all about design principles and a new way of operating IT with agility. And it's about answering that promise that we've talked about in IT for the last 20 to 25 years, about enough agility to respond at the speed of mission or the speed of business. And what we're seeing now with this rise of hybrid is people are looking at workload placement based on the mission or business need rather than looking at cloud as a destination. You know, for the longest time, Microsoft and Amazon, who are two fantastic partners of ours, do a brilliant job in their marketing. But when we look at cloud in that context, we look at it as a destination. So if you're a customer that has a desire to move there, you've got to maximize your workload or put it into a format or data into a format that makes it more friendly to move into a cloud environment. There's costs there. What we're actually seeing in today's world with great partners like Big Switch is the ability to software define existing data centers and basically cloudify them so that we can bring the efficiencies of the operating model to the customer on premise or wherever their mission or business may take them. And when we look at certain other segments in the public sector like Department of Defense, this is critically important when we talk about the tactical edge or the tip of spear in the mission environment. So quite frankly, Sharon, in summary, it's still a very exciting time in the cloud market space, and the rise of software defined in the data center and in the network really is creating this bastion of innovation now that customers are able to leverage in any capacity once they adopt that operating model principle.
Thanks, Cameron. Paul, what are your thoughts?
So, yeah, thank you very much. And I agree wholeheartedly with what Cameron is saying. Federalize it's a very unique environment. They were very early to the stage to adopting cloud as an operational model. But that even being said, in a lot of cases, there's still a lot of new deployments going on out there, which, and for federal agencies, since they have such a vast type of unique requirements, depending on whether or not we're talking civilian, we're talking military, or any other type of application, all of these create such unique type of deployments, whether it's a massive military deployments, myself being a veteran, having done that myself, understand it's a very unique kind of environment compared to what their civilian counterparts have to deal with. So not only do they have to deal with the traditional environments of problems of how to get compute and storage and actual make sure networking is working between locations, you also have so many other factors that they're trying to deal with at the same time. Then you add into the fact that I think the idea that cloud is a location, as we've already said several times, people, and I think the federal environment as a whole, have realized that it can't just simply be perceived as somebody else's location. That cloud is actually everywhere. And as we get bigger and bigger deployments out there, and a vast majority of them unique capabilities required out of each one, it challenges every single environment. You have to look at it in very unique, almost as a project-to-project basis, and it creates a strong need to approach things differently every single time. So it requires a lot of help from partners and the teams internal.
It's a great point. And I think the more it grows and the more technology grows, we also see some complexity that we also have to deal with. What are the biggest challenges federal agencies face in scaling hybrid cloud?
It's interesting. A lot of the lessons learned that we've gleaned over the last 5 to 10 years, really we can summarize those great lessons learned, because we have to look at them as not challenges or even opportunities, but great lessons learned on how to get better and more efficient. When I look at some of the challenges we still face in scaling hybrid cloud, first and foremost, I think it's about setting the appropriate expectation right up front of what your cloud journey is about. We have just an amazing engineer I've taken these 3 laws from, and it was from an article from Pat Gelsinger, who runs VMware for us. There's 3 basic laws that govern a cloud strategy, and these are 3 laws that we really can't get around. And it's the laws of physics, the laws of the land, and the laws of economics. And these laws help you define your North Star in this journey for cloud. The first one about the laws of physics is you need to determine, and part of the challenges we face with hybrid is, where do you want your cloud to be and how do you want it to operate? Because as we know, laws of physics we can't really change. The speed of light is the speed of light. Networks create latency when you put nodes out into the field. So you have to begin to define your data processing strategy, your data strategy, and where you intend to really employ this cloud technology. The second law, which is the laws of the land, you have to look at things like statutory requirements, legal requirements about where data can rest and reside. So this can be either in country, or if you're on a military base overseas, how do you deal with the sovereignty of the data? That's really the law of the land, is where can it sit? Where can you bring this compute and cloud capability? And then the laws of economics kick in, right? There's only so much budget the government has available to it, but the government also has to recognize, for the longest time, we talked about cloud being of a savings and getting people out of the data center business and focus more on mission. On what we're actually seeing in today's world with these challenges, people are not getting out of the data center business. It's actually getting a bit more complex when you think of people's digital transformation, but it is about partnering better to be able to run them more efficiently. So when I look at the challenges, it's about setting your North Star correctly for your cloud challenge and strategy, setting the proper partnership with industries so that you can transfer these skills into your next generation workforce for the government, and understand it's really about mission enablement, mission alignment, so that gives you a good North Star strategy to focus on rather than economics, because we're seeing very clearly that the economics of on-premise and hybrid are far outweighing what we've seen over the past several years with public cloud.
Setting expectations first is absolutely critical. many of the environments who have tried to deploy cloud over the last few years have discovered that the cost benefits aren't anywhere near what they thought they were going to be, because they didn't properly set their expectations about the reasons why they're going into cloud. Oftentimes, I think cost is something that is forefront in many people's minds about the reason. When you approach a cloud deployment, the why and the where are actually what matter most. The value of what it's going to bring to the team and to the project's performance and the capability of supporting users. Ultimately, when we're talking about cloud, what often gets lost in the conversation is why are we actually deploying data, compute, and storage at different places? Ultimately, it's all about supporting users so that they can get access to data, complete their mission, do their job, all the combinations of things like that. If you take it from the user's perspective first and then work backwards, you end up with a far better understanding of where different elements should actually exist. And by taking that approach, and you have less of a perspective of cost, and you have more of a perspective of productivity, performance, and all the capabilities, you actually are able to perceive the design better. And scaling of this is kind of interesting. As you grow out, you can learn a lot from what the cloud service providers have done over the last few years. For example, many of them, not even many, all of them are using SDN. It's all around us and everywhere. That has enabled them to do things that are considered miraculous by compared to the traditional data center designs. And it's pretty important to note here that when we often say cloud, all we're really talking about is a modern data center design that allows better access to the resources that users need. That's a different way of thinking than simply deploying a bunch of switches and a bunch of servers and a bunch of storage. Now we're actually talking about how they perform and adapt on key to whatever is needed by the users and by the actual applications. And it's kind of interesting is that we went through these different phases of technology where in the past we were turning different types of hardware into applications. Today, those applications are turning hardware into APIs. And it's a really interesting flip there. Scaling this becomes pretty important because ultimately what you need is the best flexibility and the adaptation required on performance keys no matter where they are in the world. Federal obviously having unique requirements as it's deployed around the world is an interesting environment. It's probably the best example of multi-cloud that we exist in the real world. And multi-cloud, not simply the idea that you're using multiple cloud providers, but the idea that you have multiple cloud locations, multiple cloud requirements. Managing that, though, in a traditional sense of the old school style of switch by switch, server by server is really untenable. That's why you've seen so much from the cloud service providers moving to single dashboard views and moving to just service configuration and having the service automatically built, instead of having monumental teams try and manage individual components, because that just doesn't scale and it doesn't give you the speed to adapt to the needs of the mission, for example, whether that's a civilian mission or it's a military mission. Another aspect is that you can learn a lot from the cloud providers in how you deploy on-prem, because on-prem is part of the cloud too. That's a fundamental thing about hybrid. It gets lost in all of this. Oftentimes, I speak to a lot of CIOs out there, and when we have a conversation, I point out that you keep mentioning cloud as if it's somebody else's, and on-prem doesn't really get part of that discussion. Well, the reality is more than half of all the deployments of cloud will still have an on-prem and a lot of workloads on-prem. Federal is a great example of that, given the sensitivity of information, the locations, and all that. How do you make all of these locations act as one homogeneous cloud? It means we have to use one type of technology to use across the board so that the experience for the people managing it, using it, is synonymous no matter where they are. They shouldn't know or have to worry about, is this somewhere in AWS? Is this somewhere on-prem? Is this anywhere else in the world? Because they'll notice a difference. They should never notice a difference. And the great thing about this is you can learn from them as well as taking a region approach. Region and availability zones have taught us the idea of how to scale monumental environments, but also be able to manage them in local environments. So it's easier to understand, easier to manage, and scales in a way that almost seems infinite.
Both you and Cameron are talking about is really best practices. My next question is, what are the top best practices you would recommend for scaling a secure hybrid environment? You've mentioned a couple. Can you give us top of line what you think?
Sure. One of the most important aspects of scaling in a cloud environment today is how do you make things more autonomic? understanding what the actual compute requirements, the storage requirements, and the networking requirements out there is also a fundamental thing. If you approach it like we did before, we just bought massive quantities of things hoping that we had enough, then you might end up with a gluttony of information, of capacity, but also more importantly, you might actually end up with less than what you thought is needed. And you'll have to quickly scramble to try and catch up and get more. So having a deeper understanding of the requirements, the locations, but also the end users who have to support it and the end users who actually need access to information. Having an autonomic approach is also pretty key there, and that's one of the things I often talk about is, the value of an SDN approach is not simply just a new technology. It allows you to actually see things in a more secure manner, managing it, but also allow it to actually see the environment more clearly. There's a couple of ways of looking at that. For example, if you understand each of the environment and you can design on that regional basis, the SDN components can sit there in each region and communicate with each other to help build out, scale, and understand what's required. And the other thing about this is having an autonomic approach means that the deployments of this thing become incredibly simple. With an SDN approach, you see out of the cloud providers, for example, what they've been able to do is as you start installing new equipment, it automatically discovers each other. It automatically configures the environment as needed. We shouldn't require PhDs to go out to a new deployment, especially when we're looking at a precipice of massive edge compute where the data center is no longer a concept of a headquarters place, but is every edge, every train yard, every deployment that exists out there as one extension of an overall cloud. In that model, we have to start looking at things differently. We have to see how resources are required in different locations and then adapt where they live on the fly, which means you really have to understand what the users are doing at those locations, not only before they go there, but also measure it as they are out there.
Yeah, it's interesting to dovetail on a couple of things that Paul mentioned. When we look at scaling and some of the best practices, his first point really is one of the more powerful ones. It really is about maximizing the adoption of automation and all of the automation that's available in the software when you think of software defined in not only a data center, but even in a forward setting. And I'll give you a use case that most people can relate to. It's on the private sector side. When you think of some of the great work we're doing, like with Tesla cars, right? Tesla really is a driving small data center when you think about it. That's when we say tactical edge. That's a great analogy to give people perspective of what that edge looks like. The reason why the car is so efficient and they're able to push updates and continually drive that exceptional user experience that they have in their platform is because of using automation. We can automate updates. We can automate how certain functions on the car from a data management, the analytics, when it starts to go in autonomy mode, and et cetera. So, maximizing automation is critical. Now, there are people in the cyber world that are on two sides of the camp, right? So one side says, if you automate and standardize, then once people know your footprint, they can have you and own the enterprise. There's others, and we're leaning more towards this thinking, which is when you see critical errors in your enterprise, you can patch the entire enterprise and reduce the attack surface as quickly as possible. So absolutely in alignment with Paul that automation is absolutely critical and vital. It's how we actually are scaling the human, because there's a little bit of a fallacy associated with maximizing the use of automation, that eventually automation and software and RPA like bots and et cetera will actually replace humans in the workforce. We're finding that's just simply not true. What we're doing is scaling the human capacity to really meet the functional needs and demands of the digital economy. So automation, absolutely key. Standardization of architecture, standardization of both hardware and software, so you can maximize the automation in this common infrastructure from the edge to core to cloud really is one of the critical best practices we're seeing emerge.
Think about where we're going to be in a few years. So what do you see as the future of cloud-based solutions for federal agencies?
It's a really good question, and I am a futurist, and I enjoy the speculation. When you look at the history of our industry and you look at where we're going, there's a lot of teachings that have emerged, which is really, underpinning the expression what's old is new again. When I think of where we came from in the distributed and embedded world. We migrated to mainframes over time, that centralized computing. We went back to this client server kind of capability to modernize into the next gen infrastructure. We're consolidating into this cloud capability. But what we're seeing emerging and what we're seeing in this era of data is it's all about the edge. And it's all about the edge. It's about fog computing in the middle. It is about, when you look at the intersection of these emerging technologies, which will be transformational, things like 5G, right? 5G is going to significantly expand the edge opportunities. So if we get caught in this mindset that cloud is a destination, then we're going to be stuck in another legacy trap, just like we are right now with these legacy systems and capabilities we have. But if we begin to really challenge conventional thinking and adopt cloud as an operating model, look at the opportunity available to us with 5G, with autonomy and autonomous vehicles, and other things that are occurring, for us, when we think of cloud, it really is going to be about that edge back and leveraging those principles and those laws of cloud computing to help us deal with this data explosion that's going to happen over the next 2 to 3 years, right? What's fascinating is it's moving at such a pace, it's almost unfathomable for us as humans to imagine that we're rounding out on zettabytes and yottabytes of information that are being produced today, all of which we're looking to glean insight from. And in order to do that, we have to challenge conventional thinking. We have to challenge the way we look at data management and data management tools today. And what underpins all of this is why this partnership we have today with Big Switch is so vital. It's all about software defined. It's the only way when you can instrument hardware with software to build that flexible next-gen enterprise, starting with the edge back. It's the only way we're going to survive this and really move into the next era, which is all going to be about knowledge management and knowledge.
Yeah, the future is always this hard magic 8-ball thing to kind of predict. But the one thing that is very, very clear, especially, Cameron touched very, very good on a lot of these concepts here, is that, look, cloud is all around us. It's not an out there location problem. It's such a integral part of an organization's approach to how it actually supports its users and support its projects and missions. The interesting thing is, the point with Edge is that cloud is becoming more homogenous. It's about being everywhere. It's in your hand. It's also the capabilities of wherever you need to be as soon as you boot back up, as soon as you get off a plane, or as soon as you're trying to get the job done. It's always there at your fingertips. Further, networking clouds are becoming more and more about things rather than just people. And security is always going to be top of mind. It's not simply about how do you do traditional security methods about firewalls and IDS. Those will always be part of the problem and part of the solution. It's even further than that. There's a lot of conversations about what is segmentation and what's the value of segmentation, for example. And ultimately, what they're really pointing out there is that every single layer of a cloud deployment needs to become part of the security footprint. How do you allow the network to become part of the security stance? If you use segmentation, for example, not just micro-segmentation, but even macro-segmentation, you can protect things from other things that have been compromised. You can protect people from things that have been compromised, or even more importantly, you can just hide them altogether so that they're never even seen as an attack vector. And in a cloud environment where everything's connected to everything, segmentation is an example of something that's really critical. Having an SDN or software approach to that allows you to approach these things in a bigger issue. And SDN is a great technology, but ultimately you have to think about what is it that the software can do. And as Cameron pointed out, SDN allows you to do a lot of things, but with a combination of things like AI and ML, we're going to be able to do even more and adapt to different attack vectors. We're going to be able to adapt to new mission needs on the fly so that we can actually scale and meet the needs faster than we ever did before. And ultimately, the whole point of us trying to make these enhancements is to become more flexible, adapt on the fly, but even better, be more productive. And over time, I think it's going to be really critical that we keep adjusting and taking measure of what's actually being used and what's being built, especially if you're using on-prem versus in the cloud. And and what's actually still being used. In a lot of places over the last 30 years, as Cameron pointed out, cloud's not a new concept, but it is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. And there's a lot of orphaned deployments out there. There's orphaned IPs, there's orphaned segments. Taking measure of those things is really critical as well as we move forward. As the technology matures, what has been deployed is taking measure of that's going to be really, really critical. And IT is has to become more of a partner rather than just simply an implementer to the organization. This allows IT to take a more driver's seat approach to how these different types of technologies are being deployed and used, allowing them to become more productive as well in their jobs and ultimately helping the mission get done in a more balanced way.
So we do have a question from our audience. How do you balance kind of that human interaction and not frustrating a user with being locked out of certain things? How do you balance that with the need for security and visibility?
So Sharon, I'll be happy to start that one. I grew up in the systems administration space, and I grew up in IT operations before getting into leadership. And there's a golden rule that you learn rather quickly as a systems administrator. It's easier to give than to take away. So when you think of users and giving them access with a proper security posture that's compliant, it really comes down to complement what Paul said. It's got to be user-centric design. So when you look at users that require access, let's say they work in a finance department, understand what that profile looks like for that finance user, involve the business, have them approve what the profile looks like, and then provide that access. What this really is the underpinning of is the beginnings of going to that zero trust model, right? Where we provide the minimum viable access necessary to perform your job. This way you can handle a lot of the access controls by exception, which can be onerous at times, but it allows the business and IT, as Paul mentioned, to have that open dialogue and conversation about a balance between the need for security and compliance, but the need to function and allow the mission and business to really operate. So it's really critical to understand the user needs and profile. And then as we talked about throughout this session, massively simplifying the attack surface and the background by going to this cloud-enabled operating model and software-defined data center will allow you to really drive better granularity with your access controls when you think of things like micro-segmentation to applications and the other things that we can do now in this broad new operating model to help in the overall user experience and access to information.
I couldn't agree more with Cameron. It's it's always harder to take away from deployments and users once they become accustomed to things, and also resonate very heavily. Also having a sysadmin background myself, understanding a day in the life for users is such a fundamental key in making sure that you're not constantly trying to adjust or making their life unduly complicated. Workflow and awareness makes it easier to manage their access over time. If you can also empathize with how they're trying to approach life and the things they're trying to get done, because if you make their life more complicated, you're making them less productive, and ultimately you're going to have to keep trying to manage it, making your life more unproductive. Simple techniques like how to use single sign-on, that'll make so much difference in a lot of people's approach to life. And everyone thinks they have single sign-on, but oftentimes you don't. If you have to log in more than 2 different systems in a different way, maybe the same password but different ways, that's not single sign-on, for example. Single sign-on also gives IT more control about who has access to what without them even having to be involved. So the user can simply just one day change roles, and because their sign-on's still the same, IT can automatically adapt to that based on their new role, their new job title, automatically creating templates and how they log into things. Also, homogeneous management. This is something that's lost a lot today in a lot of environments. If you're managing 2 different locations in 2 different ways, for example, if you're managing a on-prem data center in a CLI approach, but you're managing your cloud locations in a cloud approach, that means an actual RESTful API and UI screens, well, then you've got a dramatic difference in your productivity of your teams. The on-prem is going to be so much slower, so much more fraught with security issues. Whereas if you approach everything in a more modern cloud-based approach and you have API management of everything. You've got one single experience that is for the management teams and the IT department. Then the productivity of the team as a whole will dramatically increase, ultimately improving the experience that the users get and their ability to actually get their job done.
I want to thank you both. This has been really great this morning. We're running kind of short on time, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming, and have a great rest of your day.